So, welcome, Dr. Elisabet Sahtouris. And, thank you so much, Elisabet, for accepting my invitation that we can together explore today how can we learn from nature to mature into a thrivable species. I'd like to begin first by introducing you. You have an incredible career and life, and you're such an inspiration to so many of us, including myself. So Dr. Elisabet Sahtouris is widely known evolution biologist and futurist, with speaking and media appearances on all the 5 continents. After her postdoctoral degree at the American Museum of Natural History, she taught at MIT, the University of Massachusetts, contributed to the Nova Horizon TV series, and became a co-founder of the Worldwife Indigenous Science Network, a fellow of the World Business Academy with an honorary chair in Living Economies, and an advisor to ethical markets, a fellow of the Findhorn Foundation, and co-founder of Rising Woman, Rising World. She has convened international symposia on the foundations of science in Japan and Malaysia, and is currently a professor at Chaminade University in Honolulu. Dr. Sahtouris has appeared in numerous films and is the author of EarthDance, Living Systems in Evolution, A Walk Through Time, and Gaia's Dance, the story of Earth and us. And now in her 80s, she remains passionately devoted to helping humanity navigate our perfect storm of crisis to build a thriving future, seeing that as our evolutionary destiny. So, Elisabet, a warm welcome.
Thank you, Anneloes.
So as an evolution biologist and also a futurist, you have explored nature's intelligence and wisdom in depth. Would you be able to share with us what you see as some of the key evolutionary concepts that we can learn from?
Yes, I, of course, learned the traditional Darwinian evolution in universities, and then decided that there was something about it that seemed incomplete, and even that science in general was feeling like a bit of a too tight suit, or a caterpillar shell I had to molt, or a snake skin, or whatever. And I ended up going to off to Greece after I had met the author Henry Miller, who inspired me with his book, The Colossus of Marousi. To go to Greece. Also, I had a friend who was leading tours there, and I thought maybe I should just go somewhere far away and write novels to explain the human condition to myself, since science wasn't answering my big questions of who are we, where did we come from, and where we are headed. To answer which questions, I had become an evolution biologist, or as I like to say, a deep pastist, in order to see where we can go, a futurist. So a deep pastist to see what possibilities do we have when we think like futurists. So after I wrote a couple of novels, and that helped me become a storyteller, which was a good thing. And it was very difficult to get the science professors to stop looking over my shoulders as I wrote. When I decided to go back to evolution biology, I really was not finished with it at all, and see if I could put it together in my own way. And in the course of doing that, I stumbled on the one idea, which is Arthur Koestler's ideas of holons in holarchy. In his book, Janus, and he was a very well-known philosopher, his Janus, the Janus figure in Greek mythology looks 2 ways, right? He's looking in opposite directions. So he looks down into things smaller than himself and up into things larger than himself. And that is what a holarchy is. It's the nested living systems of nature. You can think of it also as nested Russian dolls. Within our bodies, we have cells within organ systems within the whole body. Below cells, we have molecules and atoms and subatomic particles and so forth. And above our bodies, we have families, communities, ecosystems, nations, global economies, and then the Earth, of course, within the galaxy, solar system first, galaxy, and so on. So the whole universe is holons all the way up and down. And the reason why that's such an important concept is that it turns out that living systems at any size scale, in any holon level, will have to obey the same principles to be healthy. So we can learn from studying cells what might work in a global economy. And that's a very useful thing to know. So that concept of holons and holarchy is the first one. And the second one is what I came to call a maturation cycle, where things in nature start out as a unity that diversifies, whether it's a mother giving birth to babies, or whether it's the early Earth's homogenized crust packaging itself as individual bacteria. There are many examples of how the diversification comes from unity. And when you have diversity, you have many individuals, and they don't all see things exactly the same way. They don't all have access to the same resources. So you get tensions and conflicts, and there you see the Darwinian part of evolution, which I call the youthful phase. And it goes on until it gets too energy expensive to continue hostilities. And there is a kind of discovery in a species that it is actually cheaper, less energy expensive to feed your enemies than to kill them, to make friends of what's around you rather than trying to protect yourself from it. And that leads to negotiations that can end up in some trials at cooperative enterprises. And in the best case scenario, you find that these cooperatives form a whole new unity at a larger size scale level. So we had originally on the Earth, the first living creatures were bacteria. The bacteria, after 2 billion years of gradual hostilities and development and diversification and contests and all that, formed cooperatives we call the nucleated cells, which is the only other kind of cell ever to evolve on the planet after bacteria. And then they started over in the cycle. So it's interesting that that cooperative phase, if you see it as the mature phase, when after the discovery that it's cheaper to feed your enemies than kill them, you move into cooperation, then you can build that new unity. But because the new unity, like the nucleated cell, is new on the planet, it too has to go through a life cycle. And so for 1 billion years, it went into the youthful mode of competition until finally it builds multi-celled creatures as its cooperative. And then now you can fast forward to the things that everyone learns in school about evolution, up to the fishes crawling out of the sea and the trees and the flowers and the dinosaurs, all the way up to us. And now we see that humans too are going through this kind of cycle. And many indigenous people went through the cycle all the way to maturity long ago, while our industrial culture comes out of what I call an empire mode, where we went back to the juvenile, the youthful mode, in order to build something bigger than what we had so far, which was basically cities as our cooperatives. So 6,000 years ago or so, we went into empire building mode, and we're still doing that. The first wave was ruled by actual emperors, and then we went into national empires, as we all know, and now it's corporate empires. And I believe we're coming now to the end of the competitive empire age, when we will move into that mature phase of cooperation, because we see that it's too energy expensive and to continue to do what we're doing, not to mention the fact that we've caused so much degradation and pollution that we're being pushed now into our human mature mode. And that's what I see as our destiny.
This is amazing. There's such clarity with what you're sharing. And I really, really, really love that. Because it's what you also share with us and reveal in this way is that we have all these different organizational patterns from the very beginning of our planet up to now. And you've just put this in a developmental context, so that we're not just looking at these patterns on its own, I like this pattern, I like that pattern, but that it's really important to understand that developmental process, that maturation cycle that you're talking about. And if I understand this correctly, what's fascinating is that in the empire building, you're saying we're going back to an earlier mode, in fact. And so I would like to explore that a bit more. So if we're coming now to the end of this competitive empire building and we're going into a cooperative empire building, how can we kind of embed that cooperative understanding in such a way that when we want to expand again, we're not again going back to an earlier mode?
Yes, and the reason we had to go back to the earlier mode was to do something larger than what we had been doing, right? Just as the nucleated cell, which was a huge cooperative built by the bacteria in their mature mode, that was new, so it had to start over in the youthful phase to build something bigger, ending up as multi-celled creatures. And just so humans, those humans who went through the youthful phase into a mature phase were indigenous cultures, and the largest cooperatives that were built during that human phase were cities. And it's very interesting to compare cities with nucleated cells. If you look at a city from an airplane by day or by night, you see that nuclear hub, and then you see all the transportation systems going in and out of that central nucleus. And you see the, like most people have seen an amoeba, a single-celled, nucleated celled creature under a microscope. And you see the pseudopods, the false feet, reaching out away from it, and the protoplasm flowing back and forth between its extensions in the center. So you can actually compare photographs of cities from the air with microphotographs of nucleated cells and see how much they are alike, providing that city wasn't built overnight in China or the Middle East as we now do. Those are not living entities, but the ones that grew from villages, usually at the crossroads in trade routes, and grew over time, expanded, were always a unified network of families and rules and things like that all along, changing things as they went, but maintaining that basic integrity as cities. But the city was then kind of an end point, and for some reason, humanity wanted to go beyond that, continue this evolutionary cycle from the competitive phase to the mature phase, building larger unities. So we could now think globally. We had the transportation and communications in place, and we fought world wars, and we did lots of international trading. So we could think now in terms of the whole planet. And that meant that we had to go take these individual cities kind of and go back to the competitive mode, even though what came in between was that we thought up the idea of nations. Now, nations are not natural entities. We scratch lines on the ground, cutting right through cultures and sometimes even cities to build the boundaries of nations. And that's very artificial. However, those artificial entities that we developed started competing with each other. And that's where the empire mode comes in. Or as we built the empires from particular cities, those empires became competitive, right? And then the nations come out of that when the competition goes into from empires to national empires to corporate empires. We now have the competition going among corporations that used to be among nations, that used to be, among the first cities. So the first empires. So you can see the progression that we have to move back now to. And the good news is that the cities, which are the most living of our current entities, have gone into peaceful mode. They do not have standing armies anymore. They do not build their empires as cities. All that's not done by the more artificial nations. So you can see why, from a biological perspective, the nations are not going to last, but the cities can. So I look very favorably at the new alliances of international alliances of the mayors of cities, projects like the Rockefeller Center, the Rockefeller Foundation, funding 100 cities to develop resilience against climate change and solve their most pressing problems. There are all kinds of things happening already cooperatively among cities. So I see that as our great hope for the future. And then not scratching those artificial nation state boundaries and having those nation states then having to spend lots of money on military equipment to fight each other, but to go back to a bioregional approach where the cities are important cellular entities, but they take into account the watersheds in which they live to do more natural land divisions on the planet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And there's so much, such a rich wisdom in what you've shared. If I even, delve deeper into that, and listening to you, it seems then, if we also take now with this, the concept of evolutionary coherence. So in nature, we're seeing that it can diversify and yet remain evolutionary coherent. What I'm hearing for you is two things. Is if the expansion happens too fast, then it will be at the expenditure of that evolutionary coherence. And as that gets lost, it starts to fight each other. And when you were describing the development of these cities, it's much slower. So it seems that the way that that's kind of grown organically, it's almost like endemic species versus invasive species. Mm-hmm. Endemic species, isn't it? They also develop their strong roots. And we can see that a lot here when we have cyclones in Mauritius. It's very clear which was an endemic species that was planted or an invasive species, because the endemic, and it can really flow with the conditions of this environment here. And so something about the rate of the expansion, the speed at which this happens, I think we really need to learn from that, because these growth models that we have developed are all about very quick, isn't it, expansion. And that's what makes them so destructive. Another thing that comes to my mind as I'm listening to you, my father, he's retired now. He was a professor in child developmental psychology, ecological psychology. So his field of research was studying how young infants develop. And what he saw every time is, as they're about to jump into a next stage of development, they regress to an earlier stage first. And so you're seeing this, the development doesn't occur like that. So just before they start to walk, if they're coming from crawling, they may actually not even know how to crawl at that time. It becomes very clumsy for a little while it nests into a different organizational principle that's not yet mature and stabilized, and then it starts to come forth. But in order to release the old state of development and the neurological networks, there's a time of instability. And then it can jump into this newer, higher order that then comes through. And in that jump, there's always this regression to an earlier developmental stage.
Yes, so, and then we go nicely into moving into adolescence, where the feisty competitiveness gets a little bit out of hand. And we expect them to move into the mature phase and become peaceful, cooperative citizens, right?
Yes, so true, so true. So that might also explain why at the moment, when we're looking at humanity's development, we can see both. We see extreme competition and destruction, and at the same time, we see all these modes of cooperation. As you already pointed out, this cooperation also between cities by a regional focus. So I think what you just offered is such an important, well, may I say worldview? How does it link to worldview? Yes.
Yes. Absolutely. And I mean, the reason you see both the competition and the cooperation at present is because we are at precisely that transition point where some humans get it, grow up before others, right? And I like the way Swami Biyandananda, who is actually an economist, says it's time for humans to wise up. So rising up, wising up in baby talk, right, is exactly what we need to do now. And so it's time for all of us to learn to walk. And so we call the people who understand, who have woken up to the need for this cooperative world, cultural creatives, as of about the year 2000, when that book came out, and said that in the United States, and it turned out in Europe, about 25% of people already had shifted to espousing green values, feminist values, inner development through spiritual practice. All of those things that most of us now see are part of a cooperative future, if we're going to make it work, already exist within about a quarter of the population for the past 2 decades. So this is the good news, is that the mainstream media is still controlled by the, let's say, the caterpillar, in the metaphor of the predatory caterpillar who eats hundreds of times its weight in a day, metamorphosing into the butterfly that lives lightly on the earth. And of course, in that story, there are the biological imaginal cells, and the word doesn't come from imagination, though it's obviously related. It's from imago, the biological term for the incipient butterfly within that chrysalis. And these imaginal cells, which have their own DNA, it's not the caterpillar's DNA, are like stem cells that have been kept inside the skin of the caterpillar, in the folds of skin, all during the caterpillar phase of that creature's life. And that's why we have the indigenous elders, and we have the people who get it, who are all there ready to link up as imaginal cells, which happens as the caterpillar body dissolves and the butterfly forms. So we used to think in metaphors like phoenix rising from the ashes. When everything goes to pot, then somehow the new flowers will grow. But it makes a lot more sense to me to see the transition, which is very fast in evolutionary terms, but seems slow to us from our human perspective, from our time scale.
Yeah, I love this. And the imaginal cell story, you can see it holds a lot of appeal to a lot of people, because they start to, also then feel that they can trust that there is something inside them that is nature's intelligence itself. That is that DNA of the future of our thrivability, rather than that they feel they need to go out to create it, because you said that DNA is already there.
Yes, exactly. And that's why I'm so optimistic as an evolution biology, because so many species have been through this before us. They show us the way. Our own bodies show us the way. We're cooperatives made of 50 to 100 trillion cells and have 10 times that many riders in our guts and on our skins, who are all helpful bacteria. In fact, there's never been any multicelled creatures that didn't have its contingent of bacteria working with it cooperatively. And yet we've done nothing but make war on microbes, thinking they're all bad for us.
Yes, and that brings me to, I'd love to explore a little bit these mechanistic systems and the mechanistic worldview, because it seems they're very different kind of principles and assumptions there. About development and about growth, and if we compare this with living systems. Could you share with us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I'd be glad to. I had several times the experience of using my biological metaphors and talking about the living earth and things like that. And I got to know what was happening when a scientist would come up with a particular look on his face, and it was always a man. And he would say, "Loved your poetic metaphors, but of course this isn't really science, is it?" And I learned how to say, "Oh, that's interesting. Why do you say that?" And he'd say, "Well, you can't prove these things you're talking about." And I said, "Well, that's very interesting to me too. I wonder if you could tell me how you proved some of your assumptions." And then we get right into that his mechanical metaphors are what I call mechanomorphism to my anthropomorphism or biological metaphors, projecting life onto my personal experience of life onto other living systems. There was a wonderful Swiss botanist who made the statement, it takes a living system to know a living system. It's been hard for us to describe life for a long time because we tried to describe it in mechanical terms. And the reason for that is very simple. When Western science arose, it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or at the beginning of the invention of mechanism in Europe. And men were the inventors, and they understood machinery very well. And initially, people like Descartes, a founding father, they believed in God, but they said that God put a piece of God mind into his favorite machine, which was man. And man was therefore a robot who could think because God put a piece of God mind into him. Woman, like the rest of the animals, was purely robotic, mechanical. Now, the reason that mechanistic worldview appealed so much to the founding fathers is because they were the inventors of mechanism. They understood mechanism perfectly. They knew exactly how to make parts to put together to do something that they wanted to do. So they played God, in a sense, as the inventors of machinery. Now, if the whole universe were mechanical, then they too could understand it, instead of having to deal with what was called the dark feminine mysteries of nature, right? So you can see why it would be very heady for them. And of course, the first thing they did was to get rid of God, because they had no more reason to set up this hypothesis of an inventor when they understood machinery perfectly, and that was obviously how the universe was. However, they too were intelligent beings creating their machines. How were they going to explain the machinery of nature without an inventor? And there was only one recourse for them: to claim it all happened by accident, by things bumping into each other in a kind of clockworks turned into billiard ball universe, right? With no players, but the balls playing themselves. So once this was the kind of thing that I could figure out when I had time freely to think on a Greek island and and trying to get rid of anyone looking over my shoulders. But I happen to have a pretty logical mind, and I saw the illogic of claiming mechanism for nature. And yet I could understand why these founders of science wanted to believe it. Make sense?
It makes complete sense. Absolutely. Yes. and it's kind of humorous. I don't want to offend anyone who comes from that worldview, but it's like trying to put the entire universe and life in a box that you've invented. So as she said, they want to stay true to their inventions, and now everything has to be conformed that. Yeah, they become their own archetype.
It took away all the mystery.
It took away, exactly.
Except that they now had to prove, how do you get life from non-life, intelligence from non-intelligence, consciousness from non-consciousness, none of which you have to do if you postulate a living universe.
Yes. Very, very true. So if we look, for the last 6 years, I've been studying what are the mechanistic systems. They have a particular dynamic, and they create barriers. I call them thrivability barriers, because their growth model is very different. Their time horizons are very different. The way they push goals are very different, and they have this polarizing dynamic that people end up who are within our system feeling divided. And so if we were to be looking at those barriers and what we could do to help transform that, so how we work with the kind of transformation within mechanistic systems to come into a new growth model that is life intrinsic and thrivable. Could you share some of your insights about that process?
Yes. The big breakthrough in science really came when Maturana and Varela, the two Chilean biologists, came up with the concept of autopoesis, which is a good Greek word, autopoesis, means self-creation, or actually self-writing poetry. If you realize poesis, poesy, is the root word of poetry in English. And so their definition was that a living entity is one that constantly creates itself, including its boundary. And that was very new, because until they came along, we generally had a list of attributes to define life, like, what was it, growth, something, reproduction, motility, reproduction, you know, very sort of just clear words about certain attributes of life. But technically, once we had a core definition like autopoesis, we could see things that we couldn't see before. And we could see the difference between mechanism and organism. And I decided to use the word allopoesis for other created entities. Auto means self, like an automobile is a self-moving vehicle, right? It's self-motility, right? So we could see now that living systems create themselves, repair themselves, grow themselves, don't necessarily reproduce. If you don't have children, you can still be alive by that definition. So the reproduction one is a possible condition of life, but not a necessary condition. And so that changed everything in the ways that we could look at nature more realistically to many of us. And when I started giving my early talks on living nature, the universe, and all of these matters, invariably women got it more easily than men. Statistically, it was much easier for women because they hadn't been trained in all this mechanics, and it just rang true. You know, it was what they had always intuited but couldn't give formal voice to. So I don't know if I'm straying from your question or not here.
No, it's okay. I think we're exploring it because it's about that transformation process. So as we now have, many of our societal systems are coming from this mechanistic worldview. Mm-hmm. They've created mechanistic systems that have particular dynamics, which make the kind of cooperation that we're talking about in order to come to more of a thrivability worldview quite difficult. We even see in a mechanistic system, some of them may cooperate amongst themselves as long as that makes them stronger competitors with others. So you can see this also in some of the corporations when they have created these huge value chains, and they've aligned themselves from all the way from the top to the supplier and the manufacturers. So that becomes very cooperative, but so they're now stronger entities to then compete with others. So it's like we're seeing this hybrid phase between starting to break through these new modes of cooperation, but there's still a mechanistic goal behind that, and which is still, so what I'm exploring is how can we best support that transition and that transformation? So what barriers do we need to be aware of in growing into a more thrivable species? And what strategies could we perhaps apply to really support that process of the imaginal self, so to say?
Yes, well, you know, evolution biologists, of course, are catching up with these things. And quite long ago, and not long after, well, when the Soviet Union first formed, their evolution biology was taught by Pyotr Kropotkin's book, Mutual Aid, and was all about cooperation. And of course, this science is always politicized, whether we like it or not. And in the Soviet Union, they wanted the individual to sacrifice themselves to community, right? To the common. Communism was about community, the greater good. And so it made sense for them to teach cooperation as natural. While in the capitalist West, capitalism was based on competition among individuals. We even made our huge corporations legally individuals, right? And so we were sacrificing the whole to the individual, the community to the individual. And when I saw that, I said, wow, they can't think holarchy. The individual is within the community, and you have to satisfy the needs of both. You don't sacrifice one to the other. You make both of them work through negotiations, right? So in my cells, which are part of the holarchy of my body, as we talked about before, the cells must negotiate with the organ they're embedded in, and with that organ system and with the whole body. Constantly, we have negotiations going on in the body to make sure that every level meets its needs. You can't run a global economy at the expense of local economies. You can't have local economies be healthy if the global economy is kaput, right? So what we need to teach people is these concepts of holarchy and maturation, so that they can see that when you're in the competitive mode, you're wasting a huge amount of energy, we call money energy, on armaments, on fighting each other, when it seriously is cheaper to make friends of your enemy than to kill them off. During the Vietnam War, one of the things we were constantly saying was, it would be cheaper to buy all of Vietnam and develop it than to wreck it with bombs and napalm and stuff like that. But you can't say that within a capitalist system, because it's competitive. And it had reasons for fighting wars that don't happen in cooperative societies. Now, evolution biology is catching up with the cooperative mode, so that starting with E.O. Wilson and his wonderful studies of social insects, we now have Tamsin Woolley Barker's book, Teeming, T-E-E-M-I-N-G, showing that humans are one of only about 6 seriously social species that have have evolved over time on Earth, so that they have literally millions of members the way the social insects do, and the underground mole rats, which are the closest in size to us. And then now David Sloan Wilson also, who writes books like Does Altruism Exist? And who shows clearly that the Darwinian selection may go on among individuals in the first round, but then when those individuals form the cooperatives, very naturally form cooperatives, those cooperatives are selected on the basis of their internal cooperation. So the whole cooperative, like nations, can compete with each other, but internally, the strongest one is the one that's most cohesive and cooperative inside, so that your population will support your wars and all of those things. We're seeing in Hong Kong now, where the people are expressing views different from their government and will not go along with the deals they're making with China in this case.
Yeah, this is very helpful. Because in the 3 case studies that form part of my PhD, what we did is, what I introduced is in strategies that within those organizations that were so competitive, which was in this case a school, a corporate organization to finance, and then the tourism industry. So completely different systems, you'd think, but what they all had in common is that there was not a lot of cooperation among the members of the organization. So what I started to do, for example, in the schools, is creating unifying themes, whereby every subject area, every teacher, also in different departments, had to work on a unifying theme. So for example, we would introduce a theme like water, express beautiful, healthy water in art, in music, in science, mathematics, in languages. And so you had one common theme through which they would cooperate and would exchange. And just by simply introducing that, you started to see new forms of collaboration, community started to grow, a sense of us started to grow. And then the most important thing was to have space-time allocation also for that, so that it would become possible. Within the corporate organizations, would in training programs make sure that management support teams and employees had shared training sessions, and I'd give them an exercise. How do you see your goals? And how do you describe the goals of each other? And how can you help each other to achieve those goals? So what could you do to really be a support for each other? And also through that, just that simple exercise, they started to get a very different experience of each other. A lot of distrust started to fall away. So to me, that, you know, what you just shared is beautiful, because it's like the theoretical understanding behind some of those strategies, and I've seen that that works. Yeah?
Yes, when I was at MIT, my best friend there, a tenured professor, thought up an eco-literacy project, and that was a new word at the time. He may even have started that word, where he had the students study their local ecosystem in the same way that you did with water. They started with their river basin, and they did all of the math and chemistry and the different courses that you normally take when you go into that big engineering school, all in terms of how the ecosystem functioned. So it was the same thing that you found worked in the school also helped them to start understand living systems and to get somewhere with it, to make it all more alive and creative for all the participants. So the students have more fun that way, right? And are learning much better the natural systems. Of
Yes.
course, MIT remains devoted to the Center of Artificial Intelligence and things like that. And it's because of that mechanistic worldview that's hard to get rid of and to replace with poetic metaphors. But you know, it's very important for people to understand, because science is on such a pedestal in our culture, that science too rests on stories. These stories are a set of statements dignified with terms like axioms that describe the universe science studies. Because, of course, science is about research. It's about making theories and testing them, right? But how do you make a theory about a universe or a planet or a cell if you have no idea what a planet or a universe or a cell is? So, you know, if you have to make some statements about what a universe is in order to make the first theory about how it works, right? So Western science, for instance, came up with statements like, this is a non-living universe. To the best of my knowledge, there has never been such a term before our Western science brought it in. You know, there's never been the concept of a non-living universe before that was thought up in Western science. Certainly no indigenous culture ever saw the universe as non-living. And then I began to say, well, maybe our machinery is the first instance of non-life, because we're taking living molecules, but we heat, beat, and treat them, forcing them into very unnatural configurations. And of course, some people will argue, well, humans are a natural species, and so anything we do has to be part of nature. And that's true. But it's important to make this distinction between mechanism and organism, because the mechanical metaphors have really misled us. And as I said, they're kind of illogical if there is no creator for it to make these mechanisms, when any dictionary definition will tell you that a mechanism is a purposive entity, right? Where the parts are put together to achieve some purpose. And I think that the artificial intelligence movement suffers greatly from this mechanical model, because it actually believes things that, like, that you can take your mind and upload it into a computer and have it function independently of a body. And that's a lot of hand waving to me. I really don't think that's possible to do, not in any meaningful sense. And it can lead to some dangerous ideas. I'm not a Luddite, I'm not anti-technology, but I want all of our technology to be not toxin-free, fully recyclable, and useful to humans without destroying nature, the rest of nature.
Yes, I fully agree with you. And that brings me to the next topic I'd love to explore before we complete, and that is about thrivability itself, because you just mentioned some really fundamental qualities and conditions of thrivability. Now that word has different meanings for different people. Could you share with us, what does thrivability mean to you? How do you see that? And how would you describe what I call the thrivability pattern?
Yes, well, thrivability, of course, comes from the word thriving, and thriving is a nicer goal to have than merely being sustainable. And many indigenous cultures thrived for up to thousands of years because they were so in balance with nature. So, of course, some of the basic considerations we have to look at requires us to learn from nature. I live in Hawaii, and by the way, for our listeners, we too are on opposite sides of the planet, and both on islands, on opposite sides of the planet, and our islands have a lot in common with each other. But I'm by night time, while Anneloes is in daylight. And you will see that I am talking to you by electric light and she by sunlight. So here we are on a living planet, and we are both kind of planet people who wander around on it and learn from different cultures, especially noting that the indigenous cultures that achieved maturity a long time ago have a very different way of looking at our world than what Western science teaches. So in order to thrive, we would do well to not only look at how they worked through balance with nature, the rest of nature, also how our own bodies work. Your brain is not an autocratic ruler, it's an information clearinghouse. And it's constantly sending through the nervous system feelers to find out what's going on in any part of the body. And if any part is injured, you don't see a bunch of cells squawking at allotting extra resources to heal that part, because there's a general consciousness in the entire body knowing that the whole body must be healthy for any of it to work. And in the same way, we don't see families that are starving 3 children to overfeed the 4th. So the kind of economic system we have in the world, where we have a wealth gap as never before in history, is very unnatural thing for us to be doing. So we've done wonderful things with the mechanical worldview, but we've also distracted ourselves from the problems we caused in making all those wonderful things, in achieving all those breakthroughs. So now we're like, you know, mom is looking for the vacuum cleaner to clean up and finds that the kid has taken it apart to use its parts to make something they wanted to build. And she can't clean up anymore. So we chop down all the mangroves on the coast, and now the tsunamis don't get absorbed and destroy much more of the land. And, you know, you can think up lots of analogies to this. But the point is that when you understand living systems, you can then posit a very different kind of universe that's not non-living, but living. And so Western science cannot prove this is a non-living universe because its basic assumptions are defined as non-provable assumptions, right? So they don't have to prove this is a non-living universe, that this is a non-living universe, nor do I have to prove this is a living universe. But if I look at how it operates, I see it has much more in common with living entities than with the machinery. So they also posited in the Western science foundational view that the universe could be studied objectively as if we were not a part of it. And of course, it takes a consciousness to do that, but then they left that consciousness completely out. It's not even part of the axioms. So you can find a lot of flaws in there, and you can still say this Western science has been useful in developing technology. But there are other sciences in the world that have done very differently on a different set of assumptions. So I held 2 international symposia on the foundations of science. One was held actually in Hokkaido, Japan, to study, where I invited people trained in Western science, which is taught in every graduate school around the globe now, who had made the shift with the quantum theorists within Western science to study something much more like the Vedic science of India, which has as its fundamental assumption that consciousness, cosmic consciousness, is primary and matter develops within it. Is the exact opposite of the Western view. The Western view is a non-living material universe in which consciousness eventually develops. The Eastern view is that this is a conscious universe in which material worlds eventually materialize, right? Come into being. So you can do good science on opposite assumptions about what kind of a universe you live in. And then my second symposium was with Islamic science. Now, I had now a material universe and a conscious universe, and it turned out that Islamic science is based on the concept of a living universe, because assumption number one, Allah created the universe. Assumption number two, he created a living universe and told us to study it. So now imagine that you could have a consortium of sciences the way the religions have a world parliament of religions. Religions get their information through revelation, science through research. But both of them can have many ways of playing that fundamental idea out. And if we had such a consortium, and I'd like to do Taoist science in China as the next one, and then the indigenous sciences, because they too have done a lot of science over thousands of years in what we call just their wisdom traditions, were actually quite scientific. And they studied astrology and biology and chemistry and all of these things that we do as well, but they don't talk about them the same way because they don't pull their world apart the way we do. And that was all part of their ways of life. So imagine now a consortium of sciences at which a living universe or a living planet science could say to a mechanistic science like Western science, we love your technology, but make sure you don't put toxins in it and that you can recycle it, look at nature, see how its technologies work, right? So this is what I'd like to see, are these checks and balances, learning from each other. And only that way do I believe we can really exercise this thrivability you're after. And in winding up on these ideas, I live in Hawaii, as I said, and the Hokulea, our Polynesian canoe based on ancient designs, just recently sailed all the way around the entire Earth with no compass on a double-hulled canoe that was built by hand with its pieces lashed together to make it flexible in the waves rather than like a rigid machinery kind of boat that we build in the Western science tradition. And the way that these navigators got to cross oceans safely when they were, tiny little canoes, huge waves. Often you couldn't see the stars through the clouds, although stars were important to their navigation. So they had to learn about waves, surface waves, deep swells, fish patterns, seaweed patterns, cloud patterns, everything they could learn about nature. And by learning nature's ways so thoroughly, they could not get lost. We are kind of lost right now as a species because we've unfortunately kicked the planet into a hot age, which humans have never gone through a hot age. We have survived a dozen ice ages. Now, a hot age is only a few degrees hotter than normal, the way an ice age is a few degrees colder than what we call normal. And because of our overloading the atmosphere with our pollution, chemicals, CO2 and other gases, we have kicked it now into, okay, says Mama Earth, you want to go that way instead of this way? All right. And now we're seeing the transfer of polar ice to other parts of the Earth as the poles melt. The wind belts around the poles used to stay up near the poles, picking up the moisture and dropping it again there. But now they're so overloaded that they're falling toward the equator and dropping all that moisture as ice and snow in latitudes that didn't have that before. So we're going to have to adapt to this. And the simple way of seeing that this is a runaway mode where our planet is in now is that most people will agree that the hotter it gets, the more the ice melts. And conversely, the more the ice melts, the hotter it gets. So that's a feedback loop that we call a runaway feedback that gives you a hockey stick escalation mode, if you want to graph it, but you don't need any numbers at all to ask people these two questions. Do you agree that the hotter it gets, the more the ice will melt? And do you agree that the more the ice melts, the hotter it gets, right? So when you see that, then you see, okay, we want to build thrivability, but we're going to have to do it on a hotter planet. I visited Morocco years ago just to see how they could live comfortably in deserts with very low-tech solutions, and they abound in low-tech solutions. We know how to green deserts now, and it isn't expensive. But it doesn't, because it's not expensive, it's also not hugely profitable. It makes more food for people. It helps to sequester the carbon. It will give us a more thrivable life, but it's not going to make us a lot of money. So we have to think about, what do we want in a thriving future? Do we really want people to own parts of the earth? Or could we have a leasing program on the basis of whether the lessee is going to improve that part of the earth? Do we want to go ahead with a debt money system that we were warned about 2,000 years ago would concentrate wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and now we're seeing it? Remember, Jesus threw the money lenders out of the temple. Islam forbade all money lending, usury, and the Jews forgave all debts every 7 years. They knew that this was destructive, and here we are 2,000 years later still doing it. We are creative people. We can build a thriving world, but we have to look at all these things and talk to each other about them. And then each of us find what makes our heart sing that will contribute to a better world, because we can't all be the same thing, and we don't want old people to be the same thing. We need poets, we need doctors, we need scientists, we need artists, we need mothers, we need computer fixers, you know, we need all of you, everybody, to make this word thrivable, and together we can do it. As Rumi said, why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? We know what to do. And again, Rumi said, there are 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the earth. Do it, go for it. Look at what we have been doing. Tell the young people, look at what your elders are doing that you don't approve of, and just don't do it anymore in your generation. In one generation, you could agree not to do war, not to make toxins, to build a thriving world. Thank you.
Elisabet, thank you so much. This is such a wealth of wisdom. This is wealth to me. And it's wealth by which we can all thrive.
Thank you for the work you're doing in university and out, Anneloes, to build this thrivable world. We can do it together, yes?
Do it together, and we're doing it together right now. This is wonderful. Thank you so much. Great.